good day, and hello to all of you who have joined us. We are open for this webinar, but we will give us a few more minutes as people join us. We'll go fully online with the webinar itself. I think we'll start now. Are you ready, Kumi?
Yeah, I was just looking at the chat box. Yes, I am ready.
Okay, that's excellent. Okay, we are going to start. I want to welcome all of you to this Dawn webinar. It's the third in the series of Dawn talks on the COVID-19 pandemic and human rights. My name is Viviene Taylor, and I'm a member of the Dawn board. I have recently retired from the University of Cape Town as an academic with a background in social policy research and social planning. I served as a commissioner on South Africa's first Commission for Gender Equality and currently serve on South Africa's National Planning Commission. Between the period 1996 to 2007, I was responsible for research and policy advocacy on the theme of political restructuring and social transformation for Dawn. Now, I've mentioned Dawn a few times, and I'm sure many of you have heard of Dawn, Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, is a network of feminist scholars, researchers, and activists from the Global South, working for economic and gender justice and sustainable and democratic development. Dawn provides a forum for feminist research, analysis, and advocacy on global issues affecting the livelihoods, living standards, rights, and development prospects of women in regions of the South. Today, we are going to be in conversation during this third in our talks with Kumi Samuel. Kumi is a feminist activist and researcher from Sri Lanka. She heads Dawn's political restructuring and social transformation analysis team. Kumi is also a co-founder of the Women and Media Collective in Sri Lanka. She was involved with a campaign to realize CEDAW, General Recommendation 30, on women in conflict prevention, and has engaged in the review process to CEDAW, ICCPR, ICESCR, and the Universal Periodic Review. Kumi's work focuses on women's rights, conflict, transformation, gender, sexuality, and movement building. She has published extensively on these themes. Her most recent book, we are happy to announce, is Political Economy of Conflict and Violence Against Women, and that was just released in 2019. During this session, we will be engaging through, well, it's a virtual platform, so we'll be having an online conversation with you, but Kumi and I will have a conversation for the first 40 minutes on a set of questions that we believe are critical today. Obviously, our questions and the issues that we engage in will not be as comprehensive as we would like them to be, given the time. There's a whole set of questions and a set of issues that influence the achievement of human rights. And in our 1.5-hour session, it's not going to be possible to cover all of these. So we hope to focus on a few of the critical areas, and in the broader conversation that we hope you will engage in through the question and answer process, we would like you to share with us your questions so that some of us and our panelists will be able to respond. We will introduce the panelists a bit later, but the panelists include Fatou Sow from Senegal, Lydia from Mexico, and Sonia Correa from Brazil. We would like you to make your comments, general comments on chat, but in your question and answer, if you want us to respond to questions, please include these in the Q&A. And in the Q&A, introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, and then tell us what your question is before we respond. Now, Kumi, to come back to this conversation that we've been thinking about and that we have been trying to grapple with, there have been so many issues over many decades, and many of these issues and conditions have led to massive changes in all our countries. Take, for example, globalization processes that have deeply transformed relationships within and between our states. We know that inequalities have increased and poverty has deepened. Exclusions of the majority, and I can add the poorest in our societies, have been excluded from the benefits of development, and their exclusions are increasing during this COVID-19 pandemic. We note also that environmental, epidemiological, and economic crises have been a part of the global system that is underpinned by what many of us call predatory forms of neoliberal capitalism. For many of us, especially for those of us who've lived in Africa and fought for liberation, national liberation, the euphoria of national liberation in the decades since the 60s, the 70s, and more recently in South Africa in the 90s has evaporated alongside the steady erosion and the brutal erosion in many cases of human rights. The durabilities and permeability of neocolonialism remain with us and are underpinned, as we all know, by patriarchy, discrimination, and exploitation on the basis of gender, sexual orientation, race, caste, religion, location, and class. We experience the durabilities of colonial and post-colonialism in our institutions, in our trade agreements, in the dominance of regional and global institutions, and in the cultural processes and symbols of exploitation and repression that permeates every aspect of our lives. The inherent violence and inequities embedded in our systems manifest in many ways. In the gender-based violence and femicide, the increasing levels of gender-based violence that we experience, in poverty, in the erosion of human rights, and we can go on. Now, in the current context, upholding human rights, achieving inclusive and equitable development, and respecting diversity and human dignity becomes more critical than ever before. When we look back, Kumi, and at the same time review the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic, issues of human rights are front and center. Even as violations of rights take place, there are different actors and forces that combine in new alliances to act with impunity against human rights. Added to this, there are contested understandings of rights and the intersectionality of the conditions that influence human rights. During these periods of social and economic crises, issues of unequal power, inequities, and brutal exploitation become more acute and reinforce the systemic underlying conditions. We've also seen debates on the complementarity of human rights, of human development, and human security. And these debates have been ongoing for decades. Kumi, in your view, can you give us a short overview of the critical periods in which human rights, especially women's human rights, came to the fore, and some of the pushback being experienced against human rights during the current period?
Yes. Thank you, Viv. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for joining us. This is indeed a surreal time, a time when every imagined certainty is upended. It's a time of chaos, and certainly with regard to rights, yes, we do have a whole range of problems, I think. And it is useful to look back at critical moments in time when we were able to bring women's human rights to the fore. I think this is very important. This pandemic and this crisis for me actually takes me back to the UN Human Rights Conference in Vienna in 1993, which was key, I think. And that was where we were able to affirm the universality, the indivisibility, and the interdependence of human rights. And I think this today is a fundamental in how we need to deal with this crisis. It was also the first time when states recognized that women's rights were human rights, that states were also compelled to recognize violence against women as a crime and to bring it out of the personal into the public realm. And we see issues around that as I will come to a little later on. It also paved the way to discussions on the right to sexual autonomy, to bodily integrity. And this was very much a reflection of our feminist understandings of the personal as the political. Again, very important today. While the Earth Summit in Rio preceded Vienna, Vienna was critical to Cairo with the ICPD and its program of action that focused on rights and choices for all. Again, a very critical achievement, a very critical process, and a very critical entitlement that we need to safeguard and work towards as we deal with the pandemic. It was also critical to the World Summit on Social Development, to Beijing in 1995, to the World Conference on Women. Actually, I think the other achievement for me is that civil society very successfully mobilized to expand and occupy these multilateral spaces. And feminists played a crucial role in all of them. It was a significant cultural, structural reason that helped us shape these global processes. And we know today that these processes, these spaces are shrinking for us. And this is something that we need to work to protect, to access, protect our access to these multilateral spaces. over the years, we have moved way beyond the gains of the World Conferences of the 90s. We have moved to hold corporates and non-state actors accountable through our interventions in the realm of work, in trade justice, in tax, in financing for development, in a lot of spaces. We have looked at extraterritoriality and state accountability, again, something that's extremely important in the context of the rising influence of corporates, and very important today in this time of the pandemic and post-pandemic. We have also achieved recognition, for instance, for rape as a crime against humanity, as a war crime. We have advanced our dealings with the impact on conflict, on conflict resolution, peace processes, and so on. And we have also sought to strengthen the work of multiple UN mechanisms, of treaty bodies. This is work we still carry on with. But like you said, there's very much the question of the backlash. You know, we see, I think for a lot of us feminists, post-1995, we went into working with the state, to engaging with the state, to engaging with policy, with legal reform, and so on. And we found the state co-opting a lot of our language, if not our ideas, pinkwashing. You know, today there's something called feminist foreign policy, you know, while states carry on with business as usual. So there's a backlash there. But then we also have, I think we must recognize and be aware of the strengthening of anti-gender politics everywhere, across states, across the global north and global south. We see this among non-state groups. We see this among civil society organizations from the right to the left. We see it within religious groups and even among those espousing secular thinking. So we must be aware of its impact on the normative frames of gender, of human rights, and this is reflected, for example, very recently in June, when the Human Rights Council deliberated on discrimination against women and the COVID pandemic. The contestations were on gender language, on language and certain normative frames on the family and so on, and that contestation goes on. The anti-gender lobby seeks continuously to impact rights and democratic processes in national as well as in multilateral spaces, and is at the forefront of this backlash against women's rights. It is also at the core of the de-democratization processes everywhere, processes that the extra-legal or extraordinary responses to this pandemic may well further cement. So yes, the backlash is also very real and very present despite our gains.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really helpful, that we are able to see there were significant turning points over quite a period of time that arose because of the struggles that feminists and women in the front line undertook to achieve the gains. And thanks for reminding us that we must also be aware of the backlash and the entrenched issues that are undermining those achievements. So what I would, you spoke quite nicely and clearly about the issues around the need for strengthening anti-gender, strengthening our responses to anti-gender policy and to right-wing tendencies. Now we know that despite the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, despite CEDAW and the acceptance of the indivisibility of human rights at the international level, when it comes to the lived experiences of the poorest and women, how does their struggles for social, economic, civil, cultural, and political rights play out in our countries? Especially during this time. And I can share with you quite a lot of research evidence on what is happening in countries in Africa, for example, and especially in South Africa. But I'd like to hear from you, Kumi, what you think is happening and how should we be responding in our countries?
Yes,
Could you
Viva.
share with us some of your thinking on this?
Yes, well, I think what I'm going to say is quite well known. The pandemic, obviously the pandemic and its responses, I think gave us pause and brought about a reality check. Yeah.
Yes.
For example, has the world of inequality and discrimination really changed for women, despite all the achievements of the UN conference of the 1990s and beyond? Deep-seated inequalities have actually not changed, despite years and years of work on gender-based violence, for instance. States failed to perceive that enforced lockdowns would put women and gender non-conforming persons at the mercy of intimate partners and family members with a history of abuse. The high incidence of violence against women during the lockdown proved again that the family and the home were not safe spaces for women, as we've constantly been saying. Yeah. So this actually has now been termed an invisible pandemic, and it certainly was invisible to states. Very few states had effective responses to this. There were little or no emergency response mechanisms in place, no means of communication available, no safe homes to go to. So it really begs us to question our work around violence against women and what states have actually done or not done in that arena. And then again, if you look at the way the response to the crisis failed to understand women's reproductive health needs or ensure their rights. Maternal health was compromised in many instances. This is true for every crisis. I've lived through conflict and I know that these are the last concerns that states deal with. Yeah? And similarly, at this time, COVID-19 health packages often excluded key requirements for women: menstrual health, contraception, access to abortion, and so on, but were absent. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, for instance, that women make up 70% of healthcare workers and social workers. Yet the pandemic highlighted the fact that they were the least protected, were at the bottom of health hierarchies, were paid the least, and worked the longest hours. Yeah? Economic repercussions of the pandemic has also changed the nature of work, the world of work, and in particular, the world of work for women. Growing formalization of labor continues to impact most on women who are consistently perceived as secondary income earners, dragging them into the precariousness of poverty. And I don't see any responses, nor even projected responses for the transition out of COVID and looking at the world of work, where women will be seen as as primary income earners. And that's certainly not part of the agendas that are being discussed. Then, of course, we know women bear disproportionately the burden of care, including unpaid care work and domestic work in the home. And this has had no respite during this pandemic.
In fact, it's worsened.
It's certainly worsened. For many women, the burden of social reproduction work has doubled, and it continues to remain invisible, it remains devalued. The refusal to accept, for example, the reality of sex work, let's say, as another example, and the inability to accept the rights of sex workers in many countries precluded sex workers access to national social protection scheme. It has also excluded them from emergency and social protection measures that may have been put in place for other workers, particularly for those countries where sex work is criminalized. This list continues the deep-seated structural inequalities and discriminations and state inaction goes on. And we have a long way to go before we realize universal rights for all. I think the pandemics actually brought this home very, very clearly to us.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly the context and some of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. I like the way you position the issues around the securitization of the state and how that has also impacted. In Africa, we've just seen some recently released research evidence that tells us that sub-Saharan Africa is said to be the worst hit region as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some researchers estimate that there's an increase in the 2020 poverty headcount ratio of 2.7 percentage points for our region. Or if you put it a different way, an additional 31 million people will be living in extreme poverty. And that's equivalent to the 2011 regional poverty level. So we are going backwards at a very rapid rate. We've also been told that there's an estimate that just 4% of households in sub-Saharan Africa will be equipped to fully comply with non-pharmaceutical recommendations for protection from the virus. Only 4% can comply with non-pharmaceutical recommendations for protection from the virus, with virtually zero in the poorest 40% being able to fully comply. Now that is tragic beyond measure for our region. In addition, in our countries in the South, it is not feasible for a large proportion of the labor force to work from home for the reasons that you've already mentioned, Kumi, and because their living conditions at home don't make it possible for them to work from home. So in response to that, we found that most governments, and especially in South Africa, we are trying to provide some emergency measures as part of the COVID response. But this response is not actually going to be able to assist. We find that people have been trying to provide minimal social protection. Now, let's take South Africa as an example. The estimates are that only 13.8% of workers, that is just over 2 million people, can work from home under a complete national lockdown. And the vast majority of workers, 63% or 10.5 million people, are classified as neither essential workers and they cannot work from home. These workers are concentrated amongst the poorest earners in the South African labor markets. And when you contrast that with 61% of workers in the top 10% who are able to work from home and who are able to make a living, and when they leave their homes, they are able to have personal protective equipment. The inequities in the system emerge quite starkly. Now, we know that most governments in the world have used cash transfers, or what we call social protection, as a means of resource distribute to lower income households during this time. In many countries, we looked at a total of 190 countries had just under 1,000 planned, introduced, or adapted social protection measures in place. And these represent an increase in measures from 103 in 43 countries. South Africa has also introduced social protection measures. We have an expanded social assistance in the form of relief measures. It's part of what the South African government calls a stimulus package, amounting to 500 billion South African rand, or approximately 10% of gross domestic product, of which 50 billion was allocated to social assistance. Now, even though these are part of that stimulus package, they are not able to actually reach everyone who needs this type of relief. So it's not just the cash transfers that are required, but there are a whole lot of other measures: access to healthcare, access to transport, access to infrastructure that people do not have. So they cannot comply with the COVID-19 regulations, and they are barely able to survive. So despite the additional relief measures, the struggle for survival, the hunger that people experience, the gender-based violence still exists. And in fact, in some households, it's become worse. And so the issues are, at one level, at a national level, you see that there are some measures being introduced. But because these measures are being part of a relief system that has not actually touched the underlying structural inequities, it's very, very difficult to make a difference. So we still have distributional issues. We still have capture of wealth, both by corporations and by governments, and we still have limits to what it is possible to do in these situations. So the question then that we are asking ourselves is, beyond health and social protection measures, what are the other measures that are being used or introduced in other countries during COVID-19 that's either undermine the hard-won rights that we have struggled for, or that can create the space for us to create a new dispensation, to bring about innovations, to revolutionize social policies, social and economic policies? What are other measures that we can think about or talk about within a human rights framework to address this crisis? It's a real crisis. We can go on and on about research evidence, but the lives of human beings are being lost at this moment in every area of the poorest communities. So what can we do? I know you've been thinking about this and engaging with some of the instruments at the international level. So can you share with us any ideas just to trigger some thinking on this, Kumi?
Well, it's a huge question, Viv. I mean, I don't know whether I have any answers to what new measures there could be that we can use. I keep thinking, I keep going back, whether usefully or not, I don't know, to our social contract with the state, for example.
Yes.
To our constitutions. And for example, South Africa has one of the best, most inclusive constitutions in the world. And I started this by talking about the indivisibility of rights.
Yes.
And if I come back to that, for me, one of the most, if not troubling, one of the most, well, something that I've tried to grapple with is how do we ensure the right to health and its enforcement as a fundamental entitlement when it's not in our Bill of Rights. And I think for many of our in many of our countries, the right to health is relegated to the directive principles of state. It is limited to progressive realization within the bounds of available resources. And now we see the repercussion of that it is not, has never or very often not been guaranteed as a fundamental right. So how do we ensure that that right is realized? And then also, as a consequence of overall provision of universal health care, which is generally poor globally, it is unequal within and between states, as we saw. And the right to health has to be realized now as an inclusive right. It is dependent on a range of underlying determinants, from safe drinking water to food to nutrition to housing. It has to ensure healthy working conditions. It has to ensure work and livelihoods, a living wage. It has to ensure that we have the freedom to control our own bodies. So the right to health calls for a system of health protection which provides equality of opportunity for everyone to enjoy the highest attainable standards of health, among other rights. So how do we go about that? Yeah, it is an indivisible right. It's dependent on the realization of many other human rights, including a spectrum of socioeconomic and cultural rights, yeah, as well as political rights. The COVID pandemic throws into stark relief the practical realization or non-realization of the right to health and the extent to which states have met their responsibilities to provide universal health care and well-being. Fundamental to this is the deep-seated structural and systemic inequalities that you talked about, that's created by neoliberal economic arrangements. And the pandemic has surfaced this, and it's now manifesting in a range of socioeconomic and political crises. So what do we do about this? Yeah, because the virus, while it can affect anyone discriminately, it does not affect everyone equally. Yeah, so it is certainly not a universal equalizer. And how do we deal with this? More universal, I mean, we see this, like you said, universal lockdowns, and something that we need to talk about. Universal lockdowns that forced migrant workers onto the streets, deprived billions, particularly daily waged, casual wage, self-employed, of incomes and livelihoods. It's still a way of responding to this crisis. And we don't seem to have any other means of responses at our disposal. We need to think about what those should be. No? We see this, for example, just take the response of the lockdown. You look at people in prisons, in immigration and refugee camps, the internally displaced, highly at risk of infection, of contagion, and many of them are marked by vulnerabilities of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, yeah? Those in institutional care. I mean, this is where we failed miserably, shamefully. The elderly, we've left the elderly to die. We see them as dispensable. It's kind of neo-Darwinism, neo-Darwinist thinking that the survival of the fittest is what now is playing out, yeah? The pandemic depends on the imperative of fulfilling the right to health and health care for everyone. It must transform our understanding and conceptualizing of the right to health and the realization of universal health care for all in real and practical terms, through expanding sufficient resources, the provision of sufficient resources, and we must be very, very clear that the right to health must be addressed as an inclusive right. And this is the only way we can get out of this crisis, the multiple crises that the pandemic called for. And so we need to revisit our constitutional guarantees, revisit our social contracts with the state, and make real our fundamental rights and freedoms. This pandemic has compelled us to do this urgently. And I think this is a process of thinking that all of us must engage in.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. The issue of the role of the state comes back. Issues of rethinking the social contract and the role of civil society in renegotiating what the demands are. The issues that you've raised are really important, because in your introductory comments, you talked about, you alluded to the depoliticization of processes that are taking place, and the processes of de-democratization under the guise of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how the rights of human beings are being traded away under the guise of sustaining livelihoods. So the trade-offs are being seen as either protecting the lives of human beings or maintaining livelihoods of people. And that trade-off, of course, as you very well have put across, is a false trade-off, because lives and livelihoods go together, and both need protection. But the issue is, how do we, looking at trying to make sense of these entrenched neoconservatism and the backlash from the right wing. And today we know that the right wing is the mainstream in most of our countries. So with all of this, how do we ensure that we can mobilize and build an effective countervailing power to mobilize around the prevention of the erosion of people's human rights, and to ensure that these human rights, and as you say, the right to health care, the right to a whole range of other social and economic rights, can be attained? What are the best ways for us to do this, given that within our national context, freedom of movement is no longer there under the COVID-19 pandemic? The press and information is not as accessible to everyone. Some governments, both in Africa and the rest of the world, are trying to control the data and information that's available to people about what measures are being introduced, about the extent of the infections, and a whole range of other aspects. So how do we mobilize and bring progressive forces together to counter the right-wing backlash that women and non-conforming gender persons are experiencing, the LGBTQI communities? And there's contradictory processes taking place. And at the one side of the spectrum, we believe that there are measures being introduced to protect people. At the other side, there are these pushing against rights. So it's a balancing act. What do we do to ensure that our democratic power and the politics that underpin what is happening is understood? It's a tough one.
Yeah, I think there is another piece in this that we need to understand. Yeah? And because to me, my focus, and particularly the focus here now, has been rights. Like you said, you know, when I was looking, particularly from my experience here in my country and in the region in South Asia, and internationally as well, the ways in which the responses from the state has actually eroded our rights. And I was looking at the Freedom Tracker the other day in relation to how governments have been responding to the pandemic and what's happened to civic freedoms and human rights. And I found that 82 countries have resorted to emergency declarations. 25 have introduced measures that affect freedom of expression. 94 countries have put in measures that curb freedom of assembly. There's a high level of surveillance of a curtailing of the right to privacy, for example. And so, I think it's very important that we understand what these provisions are and that they won't become normal. There are states of exception at this point. And we have to be very, very clear that these measures have to meet a critical standard where they are necessary. In many cases, the measures are absolutely unnecessary. They might be necessary at certain moments in time. They might be necessary vis-a-vis certain responses, but they're certainly not universally necessary.
Yeah.
Then we have to make sure that they are legal. And again, we find executive power, for example, overstepping in many cases. We find that there is no checks and balances, that the legislation and the judiciary, for example, are silenced in this whole process. Yeah? So are they actually legal? Are they proportionate? Many of the responses are absolutely disproportionate. Yeah? And many of it is discriminatory. So the question of, how do we ensure that this is only a process that responds to immediate threats, but it does protect human rights and the rule of law. And this is what I think we are not seeing. So in many cases, the decisions are unilateral, executive-led, they're beyond the scope of judicial review. In many countries, mechanisms created to deal with public health emergencies are led by the military rather than health professionals, epidemiologists, civil administration, and we see the military encroaching into civilian space. In others, this is not seen as a public health emergency, it's seen as a threat to the state. We've seen states going on war footings, using extra legal measures, and this does not require that. So,
let me share with you, Kumi. I think that the examples are many across all our regions about how the state has intervened to limit human rights under the guise, quite often, of protecting people during the health crisis. But you talked about South Africa as having a constitutional democracy. And I want to share with you what is happening in South Africa now as a concrete example of how some of the independent institutions, constitutional institutions, are trying to carve out a space to protect human rights. The South African Human Rights Commission is an independent constitutional body, and they made a submission to the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, Minister Dlamini Zuma, just this past Tuesday, to raise some of the issues around the containment of human rights and the limits that are being set under COVID-19 conditions that undermine human rights of people. And during this meeting with the Minister of Cooperative Governance, who is responsible for legislation to deal with the COVID-19 crisis, the Disaster Management Act, they challenged some of the regulations that have been put into place. The minister then said that, well, some of the issues they challenged was the issue of criminalization of offenses related to COVID-19, evictions, issues of refugees and migrants not getting the relief packages, evictions, blacklisting of creditors, and many other issues on human rights were challenged by the South African Human Rights Commission. So they had this meeting with the minister to challenge these regulations, and between the Human Rights Commission and the minister, there was an agreement that they would set up a technical committee to help government to ensure that the COVID-19 measures adopted are consistent with human rights. And they didn't only have the agreement, but they also agreed that they would set up a mechanism of for engagement within the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs to engage on and sort out issues at an early stage before they develop into a problem. So their concern was the impact of the current regulations on human rights, and they now expect through this process to look at how they will assist government to ensure that COVID-19 measures are consistent with human rights. Now, it's too early in the day to say whether anything will come out of it, but it's the independent constitutional body flexing its muscle and saying to government, we represent all of society, and it's within our ambit to ask you to comply with human rights and to challenge regulations that undermine these rights. Now, where countries have that space, it's possible to do that. And together with those institutions that protect and promote democracy, one can do that. But to be able to do that, you also need to have access to freedom of information and a press that allows you to engage and that promotes what is happening. And so I think these instruments are there to support democratic participation and to be a check and counter to the crude abuse of state power and power of other forces in our society. But that's just one example. It's too early now to say whether it will work or not.
Also, Viv, it presupposes the existence of these mechanisms and that they
That's
work.
right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
even in functioning democracies today, we don't really see that. We don't see the independent check and balance that's possible, and that's possible only through mobilization, use of civil space by various kinds of agitation, struggles. I think that's a continuous need. We rights, but rights are only a tool. Rights give us a certain normative frame, and certainly we hope that, for example, in the multilateral space, we can get the UN system, treaty bodies to hold states accountable. But your activism on the ground, I think, is what's actually essential. For us, then, pushback has to be on the curbs to freedom of expression. I don't know, and I think there are creative ways in which people find the means even to to assemble today, to be out on the streets. We've seen this in Hong Kong. We saw this with the gig workers, the delivery workers in Latin America, when they went on a day of strike. So the public physical space, I think, is today being occupied. Black Lives Matter, the anti-racism and the anti-racist uprisings.
And violence, yeah.
So there are very creative expressions of mobilization and pushback against the overreach of the state. And I think this pandemic has shown us that all states, even so-called functioning democratic states, have overstepped, can overstep. And what we have to safeguard against is that doesn't become the new normal.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point at which we can conclude our conversation and remind everyone that in Kumi's one-pager, she did say that the challenge to human rights is to ensure that the extraordinary measures resorted to by almost all states globally should be tested on the doctrines of necessity, reasonableness, and proportionality. And we hope and we must make sure that they will not be normalized post the pandemic. With those closing comments, I'm going to open the discussion with a lead in from one of our panelists, Fatou Sow. Now, Fatou is a Senegalese feminist sociologist who's specialized in the sociology of gender. She is a renowned researcher and professor and has taught courses on women in Africa, sociology of the family and gender relations in African, European, and North American academia. She's currently a member of Dawn's board. Fatou, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to respond to the conversation Kumi and I have had, and your input will be followed by Lydia Alpizar from Mexico. Okay. We can't hear you. Unmute yourself, please, Fatou. Unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to Vivienne and Kumi about your various comments. Should I say hello, Lydia? And hello, Maya Graziella and Sonia welcoming. But the issue I want to raise here is the way civil society have taken up the issue here. And I think there have been, we have had several reactions from African civil societies. But I have been puzzled by a few comments from society here about human rights and about gender rights. And I think of two points. I have only 5 minutes, but 50 African intellectuals have commented the COVID and have commented about how to rethink society and about how to and how about the pandemic affected people. But at the same time, they're asking it to come back to what cultures, languages, about local sociocultural realities, about how to come back to who we are. But I'm also, these are challenges that we have not been facing. We have not faced patriarchy, really, in very important on the issue of African patriarchy, I'm thinking of. We have not discussed about how to deconstruct that men disparities. We have not, I think, we discussed about even health issues. Who is taking care of people in this pandemic? We have not focused about what are the role of women, what they have done, how they have been challenged, how they have been critiqued on them. We have not discussed really about the dynamics that we of the way we have challenged what you call about family solidarity, healthcare. I'm because this is in English. I would have loved to be talking in the language I can control. But really, what I'm just trying to say is, if we don't deconstruct what is so heavy on women, on people, on population, how do we want to go beyond those those issues? I think we're still trapped. I think we're still trapped in ways in which we imagine what is future is we're going to be. I think, for instance, that we have been discussing a lot about the way we can transform our societies, but we have not challenged our indigenous way of challenging it.
Yeah.
We're still, I think we're still trapped in not really deconstructing our discriminations, the religious way, the social way, the political way. I think we have not, for example, we have been discussing a lot about the pandemic not affecting our health, but how do we deconstruct the impact of it, the impact of people, the impact on our livelihood? And I really think that we still need to deconstruct a lot of values, a lot of fundamentalisms, a lot of issues that we have been I mean, we are not unfolding.
Yes, yeah.
Really, a lot of those issues.
Yeah. So can we hold it there and ask Lydia to come in, and then we'll take a set of questions, and I'll ask Lydia and yourself and Sonia, if she's on, to respond. Lydia is a Costa Rican and Mexican feminist activist. She's the co-executive director of the Mesoamerican Initiative of Women Human Rights Defenders. She is also a sociologist and specialist in social movements and human rights, with extensive experience in advocacy and training on women's human rights. So with Lydia and with Fatou, we could have no better respondents to this conversation. Lydia, you have a few minutes.
Thank you, Viviane, and it's a pleasure to share the space with all of you, Kumi, Fatou, and I'm really excited and honored to also see so many compañeras in the chat also, feminists and diverse activists from different parts of the world. Thank you for the invitation and for also the very stimulating presentations that Kumi and you made, and also Fatou's comments. So given it's a short comment, I want to just make the three, 4 points that I think respond and expand in some cases to things that you have already mentioned. One point I want to make, and I very much agree with the overall assessment and points that you both have put on the table, it's that clearly major actors, well, first, as we come into the pandemic, we're coming into a world that was already in multiple crises, a world where human rights were in crisis already. So what this crisis does is deepen that multi-crisis that we were facing. And I think it's very important to understand many of the actors that are behind some of the most important human rights violations are not in quarantine. They didn't go in quarantine. And so in our region, we have seen the progression of massive projects, for example, of extractivism that are having major impacts on communities that were already under threat. And for example, we've seen mining and energy projects advancing, mega projects in different countries. So I think it's very important that we don't lose sight that all of those forces that were already at play are actually at a big party, because everybody's attention is taking care of themselves and their loved ones, those that are lucky enough that many of us to be at home or just trying to survive. But all these major forces I think are advancing. So extractivism is one, definitely anti-gender forces are others. I mean, we're seeing in Mexico, for example, attempts to undermine sexual education. While this is happening, major blocks to advance of rights on abortion, and so on. So those forces have continued to be really active and are really taking advantage of this dislocated attention that everybody has on the pandemic. This has had a major impact and backlash on the fact that then our issues and major force that we were gaining on the streets on the 8th of March, the strike and so on, we're already putting important issues on the public opinion. And now everything is about the pandemic, no? So I think that is having also an important impact. The authoritarian response is one that I want to come back to, and this point that Kumi made at the end. We were already facing a major backlash on democracy and a major trend of authoritarianism and over fascism in different parts of the world, and particularly in Latin America. So we are really concerned that these regulations that have been enforced, the greater militarization and military response in many cases, measures that are completely unreasonable, like by declaring a state of siege in territories, will continue to prevail after the pandemic, because also who declares what the end of the pandemic is when we're so uncertain. So I want to emphasize that as well. One point that for me is one of the major threats we have on human rights, it's the huge impact this is having on women's human rights defenders, on the activists, on the feminists, the precariousness of the conditions of lives of women activists in social movements, in indigenous movements, in Afro-descendant movements in our regions, in peasant movements, but also people working in urban areas with diverse populations. We did a survey with all the women that we work in 5 countries. And we found, for example, that 63% of all of the activists we surveyed had pre-existing health conditions. And half of them didn't have money to buy medication, or medication were no longer available. The amount of violence has increased not only at home for women, for LGBTI people, and for other sectors that are exposed to violence at home and in the streets. The violence has increased for activists as well. In our region, we have seen, since the pandemic started, 6 killings, multiple arbitrary detentions, raids on homes because people are at home, so it's easy, they're easy to find, and an increased spike on digital violence, especially against feminists and other activists that are talking about the very bad job that many of our governments are doing in dealing with the pandemic. There's been a lot of oppression against them, harassment, and yes, we are seeing increased criminalization as well, which is not a new trend, it's just getting deepened with pandemics. So if the very people that are doing the fight on the ground are facing hunger now, communities that were in precarious conditions and now are actually facing hunger. They're under attack by extractive companies, paramilitary, and so on, or anti-gender forces. And the situation of precarity is getting worse. Then this is a major threat for the work on human rights, because I very much agree with Kumi that is those, and we know that, it's ourselves that have to authoritarian forces that have to push for change. Lastly, I do think this is a major space for opportunities, as green as it seems in terms of rethinking, bringing back alternatives. You know, the way in which, for example, Afro-descendant and indigenous communities are facing the pandemic, bringing back a lot of their traditional knowledge, for example, because there is no health system for them. The way organizing is happening, building communities of care, putting care at the center, putting life at the center in the face of this system that is promoting death. And I think pandemic is kind of a poem to that system in a sense. Is very important. So I agree very much with Fatou that we are the challenge to reimagine and rethink the state. I think we have an amazing opportunity, because lots of the things we've been saying over and over against the neoliberal policies and state have become very evident. So what are going to be those responses, and how can those responses address really the systemic inequalities, be informed by human rights, but be informed by people themselves that are resisting in different communities, and that are the ones that are really deeply affected. I think the framing that you use for today is very important. This is not an equalizer. It's just showing the deep inequalities that were there, the deep loss in the policies and the state, and how unprepared we were all to deal with this. So, I mean, those are some points that I want to put on the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Fatou and to you for those comments. I'm going to read a set of questions that have come through. Many of them have come on the chat, and Maria Graciela has kindly sent them, extracted them and sent them through to me. I've also got some questions, 3 questions on the Q&A. I think I'll start with the Q&A. Is Sonia with us? Because I'd like her to also answer some of these questions. So the first question on the Q&A is from Brahma Mathi from Singapore. And she's been involved in doing shadow reports on CEDAW and on UPR issues. Her concern is about trafficking, anti-discrimination, and migrant workers. She says that her question is, in the current situation of high levels of digitization, she would like to say that the way sexual exploitation of women and girls and boys has changed dramatically through high usage of online access and trafficking for video recording. How can we work on this at the local, national, regional, and international level? She says she finds the international efforts are still too focused on SDG compliance to number 5. But is that enough to track and bring these criminals to task? How can we do better at the ground level? A related question she asks is, how do we deal with trauma counseling? What are national and regional budgets to raise the specialist skills to re-gear people away from this form of easy access to sexual exploitation? So there's a whole set of issues in her question related to digitization, online access, and violation of people and exploitation through trafficking and other forms. So I'll leave that set of questions, and the next set, there are two questions from Gita, and this is addressed to Kumi. She says, but I think any panelist or all panelists can answer. We've seen people on the streets in the US, especially asserting their freedom and bodily autonomy, not to wear masks or distance or keep social distance. Would curbing these people be a violation of human rights? Now, these are some of the issues that we've been talking about. The other question that Gita raises is, will social mobilizing be able to come back to the streets in countries like India and Sri Lanka in the foreseeable future? If not, what should be done? So I'll leave that set of questions. I'll ask Fatou and Lydia to respond to the first set of questions, and then Kumi, you can have a bash at Gita's question. So Fatou, will you must unmute yourself.
Can you say again the set of questions you want me to answer to?
The set of question was, it's on the Q&A. I'm not sure if you can see it.
On the let me see. I have only one.
It's about sexual exploitation through the use of online access and trafficking and video recording.
Did I answer? It's
there's a whole set of questions there, but I think the issues are quite complicated because it's not just about the increasing access around digitization. It's who utilizes digital platforms, for what purpose, and how do we ensure the safety of those who are using those platforms. So, and not the safety, but how do we ensure that those who violate those platforms are found, are made to account, and whatever measures need to be taken against them are taken. I think that's the essence of what she is saying. That's one, yeah.
Well, it's a tricky question because I live in a country where digital experience is growing, but in the very bad conditions. That means the internet connection is very poor, it's still expensive. But I think it has been used, and people made a lot of social network are very important. But for various issues, they are used for not only sexual issues, but also a lot of religious issues. A lot of fundamentalist groups have used it to set videos about from the radical Islamists to the worst evangelical churches. It has been used and used a lot. So if it's used, we have more trafficking, certainly yes, but in the same time, it has been a way for a lot of people in Africa to communicate among themselves. I mean, you have the two faces of the same medal. That it can be used for people to get connected, specifically migrant workers who are all over Asia, the Americas, and anywhere else in Africa. It has been a way for people to communicate, to send money, and it has been the worst part exactly of whatever, between sexual trafficking to to region distortion.
Yes.
So how do you
yes.
control it? So how do you control it? And can you control it? It's an issue.
So perhaps Sonia and Lydia would like to come in and respond to some of those issues and some of the other questions. I think what we've been hearing through the chat is about a whole set that there is a need to distinguish between the erosion of rights, the limitation of rights, and opposition to human rights, and how in some countries constitutionality has been suspended, and that gives rise to increasing fascism and authoritarianism as well. So the whole range of issues influence all of these aspects, but some of the issues can be also added to by Lydia and Sonia. Thank you, Sonia, for being with us and to help in answering some of these questions. Who wants to go first, Lydia or Sonia? Sonia, you'd like to have a bash? We haven't heard your voice yet. And then I'm going to give Kumi the last few minutes.
Hi, sorry, I was having a problem with my mic. Yes, no, I wanted to just do a bit of a broader comment on the second part of the first question, which speaks to, I think, I mean, something, the specifics here is trauma counseling, but I do think that there is a big question around mental health and the impact this pandemic is going to be having on that. And we are seeing it already with all the activists we're working, where there is high levels of disease, of infection in their families and communities, and when we're losing a lot of people, activists themselves and so on. So I do think it's a huge issue. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that we're seeing major cuts on all social programs because of the attention to the pandemic. So we have very bad projections of growth, which of course is not only the indicator, but are going to be used to say we have to cut. And for example, in Mexico, yesterday, the National Women's Institute got a 75% cut of budget for this year. So I think one big challenge is how will social programs that will be so needed and are needed now will be there to really support all what is needed, including health, basic health in this crisis when fiscal resources are not going to be there to support. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And I think that I think that we are seeing a combination actually of what you're mentioning, definitely constitutional, basic constitutional guarantees being suspended, for example, in Honduras, complete suspension, or practices that I haven't seen in many countries like in El Salvador, where they open camps to detain people that are suspected to have the virus, but that been used to actually detain opposition. For example, journalists and activists that are supposedly not complying with wearing the masks and so on. So we're seeing a mix of different measures that in some cases imply the suspension of constitutional rights, and in some others are just outright rights violations that are not justified by states. So but at the same time, I think people are going back to the streets. And I want to give you the example of Chile, where we were seeing major mobilizations on the streets. And right now, in the streets this week, they're also going back. So I think that there is a lot to learn, and it's a scary time because of how vulnerable many people are to getting infected and dying with systems or not resources to survive if you get really sick. But at the same time, I think we have a lot to learn from the mobilizations from the US and the major impact that I think they're having to put in really at the center the racial justice and anti-white supremacy agenda.
Thank you, Lydia. And Sonia?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good night, everybody.
Good afternoon and welcome.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's lovely to see some close friends that I haven't seen for a long time in the chat. I cannot see your faces, but it's lovely to know that you're here. I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to pick up again something that Lydia said, and it was also said to Kumi, that I have said myself in the previous talk, which is that for me, the COVID crisis is a sort of a prism that is illuminating the crisis and the disasters that were there before, just beside us, but under a certain couch of normality. And the COVID came and gave us those prisms to see that more clearly.
Exactly.
So what we are seeing is not exactly nothing very new, except that it's more illuminated, and the contours and clarity about that is more sharp. So there was a question about how, and Vivienne posed it, about how to look forward. And my response to this question, I have been asked that question many times the last few months, at least since May. And my response is always that I think that those windows of seeing with new eyes what was already there that have been opened by COVID should remain open. The only way we can move forward in terms of our rethinking in order to grasp with the tragic inequalities of the world, the levels of brutalism, to use Mbembe war terminology, of state brutalism, but not just state, also gender and sexuality related. We have to keep those windows open, even when it's very painful sometimes to do that. And in that regard, and because our team is human rights today, I think that one of those illuminations that COVID provided is that states of exception are always lurking behind any form of state, including liberal democratic regimes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this requires us to have clarity about that, because it also imposes limits to human rights themselves. So I think that the crisis forces us to think of human rights, as we have said in our book with Ross Pachesky and Richard Parker quite a long time back, that to think of human rights as both indispensable but also insufficient. To tread that very thin line between the indispensability to defend human rights always, but also to recognize that there are limitations. It's a very, to be in between, I think it's something that we need to keep open as we think forward towards what may come out of the world after COVID. To be a little bit more optimistic, I really do think that there are signs that the depth of the crisis and that in non-inhabitable conditions of the world have become so glaring in these last 4 months, that there are forces and actors that we're not talking about this. They are coming into the arena. And I do think that we should not dismiss that just as cooptation or ideology. There are movements that are happening that I think are very important. I want to mention, for example, the discussion pushed by Costa Rica at the WHO level about the access to the vaccine that is engaging other countries and other actors. The debates at the EU level now, the European Union level now, about a big package that will be about redistribution and a greener economy. We should not mystify that, but I think we should pay attention to that. Even the discussions about universal basic income, the reconstruction of health systems, I think we have to pay attention to those dynamics and not just totally be suspecting of them, but to keep track of that. Not that I think that is going to be translated from words into reality. It's very easy, but I think we should keep track of that. And lastly, I want to make a brief comment on the question raised on digital violence, sexual violence in the digital world. I think this is a very complex question that would require a specific discussion, because the politics and the question of rights and freedoms within the digital universe is a question in itself. Dawn is positioned to promote that conversation in the next stage, so we don't have the time to do that. I just want to say one thing. I'm a little bit concerned that in a moment where one of the most dramatic effects of COVID is exactly the jump out of the box of increasing policing, surveillance, securitization, and militarization. So the armed pieces of states going over people. I'm a little bit concerned that feminists would be raising a call for more criminalization. I think we are in the moment where the question of criminal law, for whatever objective it is aimed, has to be put into parentheses, exactly because of the conditions of securitization and state of exception that we are living in. So I think it's a moment also for feminists, I think, to start rethinking their extensive use and appeal to criminal law as a sort of pedagogical instrument. And I'll leave it there as a question.
Thank you very much, Sonia and Lydia and Fatou. And I think, Sonia, your last comment fits well with what Fatou was saying about how feminists need to deconstruct the issues because they are so complicated before we make our responses, both within the household as well as within broader society, so that we just don't take a blanket approach and worsen the situation, given the time that we are in. There are so many questions that have come up and so many issues, but there's no time to deal with all of that. I'm going to give Kumi 2 minutes to make a closing statement. And just to alert all of those who remained with us throughout, we had a very good level of participation from people who came on board. And there is going to be another in our series of Dawn Talks, and that will be sent to you quite soon. It's on Kerala and the pandemic, responses to the pandemic. Kumi, just a few minutes for you to close up.
Oh, okay. I was not able to unmute myself and I was worried.
Okay.
I think I can close with Geeta's questions actually, yeah? And I think this is something, like Fatou said, the question of deconstructing. Your question about the right that, many people in the US, the right-wing US, have been promoting their individual right over the right of a collective. I think that's the contestation with the proposing that you have a right not to wear a mask, or you have a right not to engage in social distancing. But are you then compromising the collective rights of people not to be infected, for example? This is very similar to, for example, hate speech. You can say, I have a right to say what I want to, but do you have the right to violate another person's right in doing so? So I think that would be, I mean, I'm not a human rights lawyer and I don't know what the arguments are, but I would say this is a contestation between individual rights and collective rights. In terms of what we can do in India or in Sri Lanka, and I agree very much. I think, Sonia, we are definitely seeing the states of exception at work here. The question you're posing to us feminists about criminalizing and using the law in that way, I think we're certainly looking at that very critically in Sri Lanka. We are not. The human rights movement or the feminist movement's not asking for criminalization. We are asking for decriminalization. We are asking, for example, for the prisons to be cleared of offenders who have either no charges against them, people in remand, or people who have charges that don't need to be criminalized. We've been fighting against the death penalty and so on. So that's very much a place of struggle for us, a space that we want to hold. With the issue of how we begin to deal with authoritarian states, of all the laws, the extra legal measures that are being brought in, of the fear that the judiciary is in, the kind of the surveillance, the panopticon effect of, you know, the fear people have to say anything. It's a very difficult issue to deal with. But if I look at the recent happening in India, where teenagers use TikTok, when TikTok was banned, teenagers spam Modi with fairy talk, with, you know, using methods that are completely new and fresh and creative. And I think we have to begin to think of how we do that now. And I also see the street struggles like the Black Lives Matter movement, or, you know, many of the, even for India, the movement against what's happening to Muslims. Those mobilizations, I think, can still be leveraged. So as much as, and I agree fully, Sonia, with your point, and I was going to end with that rights are just a tool. We need rights at particular points. We need it as a normative frame, but it is certainly not emancipatory. It doesn't give us all the answers. That has to come from local mobilizations, international mobilizations, and to use also creatively the international and multilateral spaces at this moment, when we have to rethink, when states will have to rethink, when the international system will have to rethink, and we can engage with those spaces. So yeah, we need to look at human rights from a very nuanced space, but understanding that we still need to protect our gains and expand on that. But for me, my greatest fear is this exception that will become the norm, you know, and will become normalized with the militarization, with the lack of a check and balance between the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, our fears, self-imposed, self-censorship. So these are things I think that we need to look at in the future.
Yeah.
Our response. But thank you very much, everyone, for being here and engaging.
Thank you. And thank you for a fabulous lead-in and discussion. Thanks to our panelists for all their insightful and critical comments. And thank you to the Dawn team who put the platform together, and to all the participants who were with us. And we invite you to the next Dawn talk quite soon, coming up quite soon. Take care, be safe, and remain well. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Fatou.
Thank you, Viviene. Bye-bye, everyone.